Taiga Banjo was standing in front of a man in a white suit. They looked at each other in silence. They were suddenly interrupted by a stranger flying in through the glass door, causing the door to shatter into many shards of glass. The man who came rushing into the room immediately plopped down on the ground. He was powerfully built, with a cropped head and a scarred skull. Suddenly, another man came in after him, greeting Taiga. He was just as solidly built, and his hair was blonde and slicked back. He slung his jacket and shirt over one shoulder while the other scratched the back of his head. He asked Taiga Banjo if he was fighting someone here, too, and asked if this bespectacled guy was a friend of Luda's. The unknown man continued to lie on the floor, sprawled out in the shape of a star, while Taiga calmly answered the man's question about how he had no idea why the guest asked how this could be. The bespectacled man squinted towards the man who had recovered a bit and was looking at them in disbelief, trembling a little. Inwardly, he thought that he recognized him, and that it was Noriyuki Sanzo from Midorikikai. A blonde man named Yamada approached Taiga, and Taiga asked him if they were from Midorikikai and at the same time asked what happened to Yamada's clothes while crossing his arms over his chest. The man asked a counter question and also asked Taiga what he was wearing himself. Taiga Banjo was wearing the same clothes in the form of trousers, a shirt, and a green robe tied at the waist. Initially, these clothes were necessary for him to penetrate. The bespectacled man exclaimed in surprise, why didn't he tell him right away in such a case? Suddenly, the hostility on his part disappeared. He pushed his glasses up on his face and said with a grin that in this case, it changes everything. The man lying on the floor suddenly raised his voice and asked if the man with glasses was the boss here, to which the man smiled and turned to Taiga and Yamada and asked if he could chat with this stranger for a while. Yamada passed by and told him to wait a bit first, and then he could do anything with him whatever he wants. He glanced over his shoulder at me and said it was his turn first, and then his turn. Pushing his glasses up on his face and smiling maliciously, he told Yamada that he could do whatever he wanted. Yamada waved it off and apologized. Suddenly, he swung his foot, hitting the man on the floor squarely in the jaw. A huge bloodstain appeared on his face, leaving the footprint of Yamada's boot. Blood smeared his chest, trickling down his face. Yamada leaned over him and, with a mad face, told him to tell him everything immediately, starting with who he was working for. His eyes were blazing with rage at that moment. The man clenched his teeth tightly and shouted loudly that he would never betray his own people. With a short "I-see," Yamada's fist immediately flew straight at his face. He continued to beat him up countless times, throwing one punch after another. All he could think about was what was wrong with him. Yamada paused for a second, fist ready, and asked him if he had changed his mind again. There was no doubt, no hesitation, and he was cold-blooded. As if such a task for him is a normal job, calm and emotionless, with the same frequency. The blows to the man's face started to continue again, and Yamada continued to beat him. He threw blow after blow. It was obvious that violence was commonplace for Yamada. After a while, Yamada finally got up, standing over the man's body and looking down at him. He lay in a pool of his own blood, not bothering to move. The blonde-haired man said that now he can make a choice, which he prefers, fingers on the right hand or on the right foot. The man's eyes widened, staring wildly at the ceiling. Sweat began to fall from his face, so this was how the Yakuza really were. It was sunset outside. An orange sun shone on many buildings. Several of the men in the room were sitting on their knees, including the one Yamada had beaten the day before, with their hands folded on them and their heads bowed. Behind them were two girls in school uniforms. A voice said that they had started all this business on their own, without permission from above. The voice was Yamada's, standing in front of them, stretching his shoulders. Taiga was standing on one side of him, and on the other was a demure girl with glasses, her arms crossed in front of her and her head lowered. The beaten man shouted loudly that he could not say anything, because otherwise he would simply be killed. Yamada grinned maliciously and looked at him from under his brows, telling him that they would start with one, and that he could choose which finger to use. The man immediately waved his hands and said that so be it, he understood everything. He lowered his head and started saying that they were based out of town on a farm. Yamada specified which farm he was talking about. He clarified that it looked like an ordinary farm, nothing out of the ordinary, and the blonde man confirmed and said that it was a working way not to attract too much attention. Yamada turned to the dark-haired man and asked Taiga what they should do. The guy replied that his goal was to cover up the business with Dadas. Yamada asked if they should stay here in this case, and the guy confirmed that most likely. Another new voice interrupted their conversation. The bespectacled man walked over to them and told them that if they were done, they should let him take care of everything else. Yamada asked who he was, and the man replied with a smile on his face that he definitely wasn't their enemy at the moment, and wouldn't that be enough for now. Yamada said that the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and the man confirmed it with a smile. He approached Yamada from behind and placed something on his shoulder and asked if he could stick it on for him in a prominent place. Yamada looked down at the hand on his shoulder. It was an orange sticker with a black design in the form of a stack of bills, on which was the symbol of an animal's paw. He also approached the bespectacled girl and placed an identical sticker in her hands, telling her to do the same. The same thing was done with Taiga. The man with glasses told them to go out through the main entrance, and that they couldn't go out through the back one. The girl carefully and thoughtfully looked at the sticker. The three of them turned around and Yamada waved at him, telling him to clean up the place while they left. The man said nothing in reply. A sudden voice from one of the men on his knees asked him if he was an immortal to just let them go, and what would he do there alone. The man grinned, saying that they were fools. A hostile aura began to radiate from the man's very essence. He turned to them and said that they were all incredibly empty-headed to think that he had come here alone. Taiga, Yamada, and the girl left the building. They were met by a crowd of people in matching jackets, completely surrounding the entrance. Taiga only said that everything was clear now. They started to walk through the crowd as they parted in two lines. People continued to look at them with hostility. This sticker that he gave them was needed so that they could safely leave here. Yamada stuck it on his shoulder, Taiga on the chest of his robe. They walked past the crowd and no one touched them. 3 people were lying on their knees facing the floor, their hands tied behind their backs. There was also a girl among them, who was sitting on her knees, not facing the ground, with her hands tied behind her back. Another girl was slapped across the face so hard that she fell on her side. The girl with the long red hair clenched her teeth tightly and angrily shouted out to the man who hit her what he was doing. After all, they did not interfere with anyone. The bespectacled man replied with the same smile that if she knew Midorikai, she might as well know cats and chips. He asked if she had ever heard of them. The girl frowned and said it was the first time she'd ever heard it, to which he said it was obvious. He asked her if she started at all. The bespectacled man, who continued to smile maliciously, was the executive director of the Cats organization and Chips Natsume Hasu. The girl immediately squealed and said it wasn't her. She turned her head to the other girl with her hands tied and said that she was the one who had been telling her what to do all this time, and that was why she was the only one who needed help. She called her Anna. Anna looked at her in surprise. Natsume looked at her with a smile on his face. Anna calmly closed her eyes and called the girl the most affectionate words, to which the red-haired girl only grinned maliciously. Suddenly, that girl's face was hit by another blow to the jaw from Natsume, causing her to be thrown backwards on her back. Her face was covered with bruises on both sides. She sighed heavily and asked why this was happening to her. Natsume moved closer and grabbed her hair, forcing her to raise her head and look at him. He told her that she should have lied and that she was the one who started the whole business. Tears started to fall from the girl's eyes, and she opened her mouth and started shouting loudly that it wasn't her and that it was all Anna's doing. Natsume smiled indifferently and replied that he didn't really care which one of them was really at fault anyway. He swung his fist and added that he had already decided from the very beginning that he would blow her face off. The girl loudly shouted out why, and the man said to take a closer look at Anna, answering that she was a beauty, but on the contrary she was ugly and the real one. Large tears welled up in the girl's eyes, and at the same time, another blow landed in her face. She coughed, and blood sprayed from her mouth and nose. The girl fell to the ground, unconscious. Natsume, with a smile on his face, turned to Anna and told her that she was in for something completely different and that she could become one of the best products. And that was why he would have to be gentle with her, because he didn't want her to break down prematurely. The sun was shining brightly in the sky. A girl with long dark hair was walking down the hall of the restaurant, clutching a folder. The daddy situation that Soma was involved in was resolved by Banjo and his older unknown. The police raided the karaoke place where the business was based. It was said that several people were arrested. Among those arrested were not their students. Only Erika Kusumoto, the girl with the long red hair involved, and Anna Shiraishi. Both of them are missing. The school has put them on the wanted list and the police are now looking for them. The woman opened the classroom doors and looked inside. However, despite everything, she was still worried about their safety. Also, Soma, who decided to turn off this road, seems to have made friends. The woman turned around to see a bespectacled girl named Soma surrounded by 2 other female students, who were having fun talking to each other. One of the girls took out her phone, showing a picture of 5 men. She happily announced that she was able to get tickets to their Spade concert. Another girl asked in surprise that how she managed to get them. Soma asked which spades they were talking about, to which the other 2 girls exclaimed in surprise and asked if she didn't know about them and that they were the most popular idol group right now. Soma nodded in understanding. One of the girls pointed towards the desk with a smile and said that Shin from Spade is in their class, but rarely comes, just like today he didn't come. Soma asked in surprise if this was really true, and the other girl exclaimed and asked how she could not have known about it. She showed the screen of her phone, where a guy with blonde hair, green eyes, and a patch on his forehead appeared. The girl said it was him, and Soma said she had actually seen him before. The girl with the dark hair said that even though he was studying with them, it was still hard to approach him because he was quite unsociable. Another exclaimed and said that it was a good thing and meant that he doesn't have relationships with his fans. A dark-haired girl asked another one with short brown hair who she liked from Spade, and she said definitely Picasso. It was a guy with a wolf haircut, a dark upper part and a light lower part, with bright yellow eyes and a lip piercing. She said he had an incredibly cool tattoo, a mark on his cheek. The girl clarified and asked if she really liked tattoos, and another girl turned to Soma and said that tattoos are cool, and did the girl herself share her position. Soma considered her words. She took out an A4 album and quickly started drawing something in it. Soma asked if they counted, and showed her a drawing of a man who had his back turned and had a huge dragon tattoo all over his back. The girls hesitantly said that it was certainly a tattoo, but this kind of tattoo was only used by the Yakuza and they were not in fashion at all. They thoughtfully asked if there were any Yakuza left in their time, and the other one replied that if there were, it would probably be some old geezer. Soma looked down and blushed deeply. She said quietly that she didn't care about his age, and the girls looked at her questioningly. Another answered and said that she understood what she was talking about, and that she apparently likes calm and grown-up men, behind whom you will feel like behind a stone wall. A boy with bright red hair who was watching them nearby noticed what they were talking about. He said what kind of nonsense they were talking there at all. Another student sitting on the desk asked if he was so interested, and it was obvious that they were discussing a plan to capture hearts, and they were thinking about how to win the heart of a grown man. The guy with the red hair shook his head and said that he didn't understand anything. The student who was sitting on the desk grinned and said that their janitor could be an example, to which the young man started up in surprise and the other one replied that he should relax and now the master of love Tanabe would give him good advice. Another young man came up and asked Tanabe if he had ever had a girlfriend himself, and the red-haired man said that he probably hadn't even held a girl's hand, to which Tanabe complained that they should stop talking immediately, and that he had something that the two of them didn't have, namely dating experience. Tanabe jumped off and frowned, clenching his hand into a fist and loudly declaring that he had a girlfriend in elementary school. At that, both of them fell silent, just looking at him, which made Tanabe grudgingly tell them to stop looking at him like that. Tanabe cleared his throat and, with a flushed face, began to talk about how the secret of love was simple, namely, constant contact. Love means constant walks and constant communication. The blonde guy with a smile on his face replied that he was just saying the obvious things, and the red-haired guy on the contrary thought about it. The bell rang. The girl with the long black hair started up and said that class was already starting. The guy continued to look thoughtfully at the girls. Lunch break. The girls were sitting at a table in the cafeteria eating lunch, and the other students were also sitting at their own tables. Suddenly, a girl with long hair named Shoko was called out by someone. It was the red-haired guy. He said they could hang out after school for the first time in a long time. Shoko looked at him in surprise, but after a moment, with a grim expression on her face, she replied curtly that she didn't. The boy jumped at the reaction. This was said without a shred of doubt. Shoko closed her eyes and replied that the tournament was coming up soon and there was quite a lot of work to be done in the circle. The guy frowned a little and thought to himself that he had completely forgotten about the track and field club. The guy tried to keep a straight face and asked again what about meeting up after the tankard. Shoko abruptly changed the subject and asked him why he left the football club, and the guy answered the question with a question and asked what it had to do with it. The girl didn't say anything at first, but then she told him to stop hanging out with all sorts of delinquents because he was her childhood friend. And because of it, people look at her strangely. The guy immediately blushed and replied, didn't she care who he was talking to, and it was better for her to stop lecturing again. Shoko abruptly got up from the table and replied that in that case, he could do whatever he wanted. She turned to leave, and the guy didn't have time to say anything in surprise and gritted his teeth viciously, kicking a chair behind the table. Shoko changed into a sports uniform and ran a distance. The area behind the school was enclosed by a green grid. Shoko was running, her face dripping with sweat. She stopped and the guy with the stopwatch told her with a smile that it was a great result, and raising her hand up, she replied that next time she would run last. A red-haired guy stood nearby with his back to the girl and silently watched her. Inwardly, he thought that she should have finished soon, and if he waited for her for a while, they could spend some time together. As he walked past, he heard two voices in the doorway. One of them indignantly asked about being right here, and that they were at school. The guy looked around the alley and saw a girl standing near the wall and a guy opposite her. The guy told the girl that the morning and evening were not enough for him. He asked her if this was the first time she had ever done this, and she replied hesitantly that she had already had practice, but it was a long time ago, and her body no longer remembers anything. The red-haired boy continued to watch them, his cheeks turning a little red. He hid abruptly, covering his mouth with his hand, and then looked back at the couple and wondered what they were doing there anyway. He saw a scene of a guy sitting on a unicycle with his legs stretched out and pressed against him. The startled girl looked at him and said in surprise, what would happen if someone suddenly saw what they were doing here? The boy's face darkened, and he came out of his hiding place and asked what they were doing here. The confused girl immediately started up when she heard someone else's voice. The girl was pedaling on a unicycle and turned to the guy, calling him a Kakawa, and said that it wasn't what he thought it was. Akikawa exclaimed that it wasn't that he thought anything wrong, he had no idea what was going on here at all. Taiga was spinning the wheels of another bike and said that they were just training here, and if he wanted to, he could join them, to which Akikawa replied that no way. Taiga said that he had a good shot, which means he had potential, and it will be very useful for him. Akikawa replied that he was actually trying to beat him up, and why was he suddenly so friendly with him? Taiga replied with a calm face that it was never too late to start making friends. Akikawa said nothing. Taiga added that as his master had taught him, it was better to get along with people rather than immediately get into a fight with them. While he was talking about it, Taiga bent one leg and held onto the unicycle with one foot. Akikawa grudgingly replied that he was lying because he was the one who started waving his fists first, and Taiga replied that he only used force when it was necessary, and they didn't really need to fight right now. Akikawa thought about it, looking down and blushing slightly. He indignantly shouted at Taiga not to talk to him like he knew everything. Taiga continued to take various forms on the bike, with his legs crossed behind his head and his hands clasped in a prayer gesture. He asked what Akikawa was doing here anyway. Akikawa started to say something, but then wondered what he was really doing here. He abruptly turned his back on them and said that it was nothing, and that he was already leaving. Taiga nodded while standing with his head on the bike, and the girl smiled awkwardly and waved at him, telling him to be careful. Akikawa thought about Taiga's words as he walked back. Good shot. He remembered kicking the ball, running across the field with his teammate, waving at him about it. To pass a pass, and how he ran past it, scoring a goal against opponents and missing. How Akikawa ran up to him and grabbed him by the collar and said something while the guy just gritted his teeth and didn't say anything. Akikawa's jaw tightened. He thought that being free with this bunch of fools, Jajima, Tanabe, and being friends with the older members of Midori Kakai was the best option for him. Akikawa took out his orange phone while looking at the screen. A bell appeared with the name written on it. That's right, this was where he belonged. Akikawa answered the phone with a smile on his face, holding it to his ear. The voice on the phone said there was going to be a party over the weekend and asked if he was going to attend. Akikawa smiled nervously and stammered back that of course he would come. Gokudō, a huge dark-skinned man with a smile on his face, added that Akikawa was supposed to be friends with a pretty nice girl named Shoko Heroes and that he should call her too. Akikawa froze in place. Gokudō sat covered in one towel and surrounded by two blonde women and said that he needed a new woman and that the old ones were all broken. Gokudō kept pushing and asking if Akikawa was okay with it, and they were each other's friends. Akikawa listened to all this with a face full of horror. Sweat dripped from his face in large drops. Outside, the sun shone down on the two-story building. Akikawa shouted indignantly, grabbing the boy by the collar of his shirt and telling him that he should have passed him a pass. In response, the guy yelled at him to shut up and that he didn't come to their club class himself, so what was the point of giving him a pass? There was an argument between the two of them, and Akikawa shouted back that he was actually training on his own, apart from the others. And the young man replied that you couldn't learn much that way, and he should have understood that perfectly well, and plus, was it really so important for him that he scored the goal? And did he really not know that the main thing was not his personal result? The other guys from the team came closer. The guy replied to Akikawa that he, unfortunately, could not consider a person like him as his companion. That's why he quit football. It will be better only with your own, so everything is much easier. And then a year ago, he met me. Tanabe clenched his fist in displeasure and shouted that he would definitely not lose in rock, paper, scissors, and that today he would drink free soda and definitely win. Tanabe stood in front of the blonde while Akikawa stood in front of them and watched the peculiar exchange. All three of them began to give out a piece, and a total of 1 stone and 2 leaves fell out. In the end, Tanabe won, and Akikawa dramatically grabbed his head and said that he still lost, and the blonde added that so be it, she took him. Tanabe happily clenched his hands into fists and smiled broadly. Their triumph was interrupted by a man approaching them. It was Gokudō, a huge, tall man with a solid build and dreadlocks tied up in a bun. He smiled viciously and started to flex his fist, asking if they were the strongest among the first years. The boys looked uncertainly at the big man and the people behind him and asked if he needed anything. Gokudō moved closer and leaned in between the blonde and Akikawa, putting his arm around their shoulders, telling them with a grim smile that they should go with him and that he liked strong guys like them. They looked at him uncertainly. They knew that this guy was dangerous, and would they really have to fight him? After a while, they found themselves in a bowling alley. Gokudō threw the ball, causing all the pins in the row to fly in different directions and knocking out a strike. His face was stern and intent. He turned to the boys and gave them a thumbs up, and Tanabe threw out his arms in a solemn gesture. The next time they were at karaoke, singing songs, Gokudō sat next to the blonde man with a friendly arm around his shoulder. Then they played basketball. Akikawa was holding the ball, facing two guys, and saw Gokudō running past him, passing him a pass. Gokudō immediately intercepted the ball and ran it into the ring, hanging onto it. Gokudō confidently raised his hand up, clenching it into a fist as the others ran towards him. Gokudō happily exclaimed that they were the best. Akikawa smiled, breathing heavily. He was thinking about how much fun it had been with this guy of the year. The boys were wiping the sweat from their faces, and Tanabe said with a smile on his face that Gokudō was completely different, and the blonde added that he would never have thought that Gokudō was such a person. Gokudō walked over to Akikawa, rubbing his neck and asking for his name. The boy hesitantly confirmed that his name was Akikawa. The man gave him a thumbs up and smiled, furrowing his brows and telling him that he was cool and the pass was great. Akikawa blushed slightly at his words, smiling happily. It turned out that there are more fun things than circles. From then on, they hung out every day for a year. The time was 12 o'clock. Gokudō was sitting on a bench, holding a can of soda and crossing his legs. He leaned on the bench and said something was missing. He turned to the guys and said that everything seemed boring to him lately, and the guys were surprised. Gokudō grinned. He said that since they were friends, he wanted to show them something. Gokudō smiled grimly, glancing at the guys behind him. He ordered them to follow him. After a while, they were in front of the building's doors. Gokudō opened the doors and said with a smile on his face that he was going to show them a great place. The boys jumped up, standing in the doorway to the room. They saw a lot of strange men and women, all of them drinking alcohol. On the table were unfamiliar pills, syringes, and weapons. Someone was lying on the floor, someone on the couch. The boys froze in place. Gokudō smiled contentedly and turned to the guys, saying that on the other hand, this was still not enough for them, because they were only first-year students. But it's okay, they will get used to it. The boys' faces were grim, and none of them uttered a word. A year later, he sat down on the couch, hugging two women and adding that immediately after they get used to it, they will already understand how cool it is. Akikawa stared at the scene in front of him in horror. He tried to think that everything was fine, that if he ignored it, he was a good person. If he just pretends that he didn't see anything, then his life will remain the same as it was before. Akikawa clenched his hand into a fist. He lowered his head, gritting his teeth tightly. That's what he always did. However, Shoko shouldn't have gotten involved with all of this. It was already night outside. Akikawa was sitting on the floor of his room, leaning against the back of the sofa. He called the guys. The blonde man said that he understood everything, but asked why it was needed. Akikawa nervously shouted out that he had no idea, and that all he ever wanted to do was have fun all the time. Tanabe smiled. He said that it couldn't be helped, and that it was time for Master Love Tanabe to step in. Akikawa didn't answer the question. Tanabe went on to say that he just wanted some pretty girl, didn't he? And that in that case, he would just seduce someone and just persuade her to go with him. Akikawa hesitantly replied that it was unlikely to help, to which the guy told him not to worry and he would definitely have time to find someone for him. Akikawa tried to say something else, but Tanabe laughed and said with a smile on his face that it was finally time for his pickup techniques. Akikawa tried to reach out to him and tell him to stop ignoring him already, to which the blonde replied that it was useless, the guy was already lost. The next day, after apologizing for the intrusion, Soma entered the office and Taiga greeted her. Soma looked around uncertainly and asked in confusion if Yamada was there. Taiga replied that he didn't work at the school, and why should he even be here? Soma replied sheepishly, which made sense in principle. Taiga asked what she wanted, and the girl replied that Hero's Shiko wanted to consult him. Shiko came in and said that Yuki told her that Taiga was the one who closed the daddy business office. Taiga was startled at her words, but with the same calm face, he said that the consultation obviously had something to do with delinquents again. Shoko looked down at the floor uncertainly, clutching her in her hand and unsure of the right way to start. Shoko started by saying that Akikawa and the other boys in X class had been acting very strange lately. Taiga clarified what she meant. With a grim expression on her face, the girl explained that they hadn't talked for a long time, and then he abruptly decided to invite her to hang out with him, and Tanabe also constantly began to hit on other girls. Shoko's brow furrowed as she considered her own words. She pulled out her phone from her pocket and showed Taiga the screen where the conversation was open. Shoko said her friend gave it to her. It was a correspondence with Tanabe, in which he wrote to her classmate that he had a new way to have fun and was not interested in it, but the girl refused and sent him in a rude form to hell. Shoko asked the man if he knew who Gokudō was, and he shook his head. The girl explained that it was a high school student who has always a lot of problems, and 3 of their guys with him just recently began to communicate. Soma chimed in and said that it was one of the Midorikikai performers and that she had heard other people talking about it. Taiga looked thoughtfully in their direction and asked if they were talking about the Midorikikai, The organization that just dealt with. The girl replied that it was true. Shoko replied with a grim face that in her opinion, if you don't intervene as soon as possible, then everything can end badly and it will be too late. Taiga calmly replied that he had heard her and what exactly she wanted. Shoko clenched her fist, her face serious. She replied that she only wanted him to help clean up the school. Taiga immediately replied that he would help, to which Shoko exclaimed in surprise. Taiga seriously replied that the situation in the school directly affects its cleanliness. Soma and Shoko thanked the man, bowing low to show their gratitude. Shoko raised her head and asked Taiga what exactly was he going to do. The guy replied that he already had one very good idea. After a while, a beautiful girl appeared in front of them. Long hair, flawless face, beautiful clothes. It was Taiga. The disguise was complete. Shoko asked in surprise if it was too cool for him to do it. Taiga replied that in his previous job, he had never changed into a woman before. Shoko wondered if he used to work as a hostess or something. Taiga turned around and said that all that was left was to contact Tanabe, and the girl stopped him. With a serious face, Shoko said that she would go with him. Taiga looked at her over his shoulder. Shoko added that she wants to see with her own eyes what exactly is going on there. Taiga didn't say anything, but after a few seconds, he agreed. He added that it could be quite dangerous, but he respected her determination. By next week, Shoko was standing next to the girl disguised Taiga. They went inside and saw people walking and having fun. It was the site of a Midorikikai party. The blonde in the pink dress let out a cry of joy. Isn't that funny? And Shoko smiled uncertainly and confirmed her words, thinking to herself that she was playing along very badly. Suddenly, a man walked up to them and put his arm around Taiga's shoulders, inviting such a beauty to have a drink with him. Shoko immediately panicked and thought to herself that this was too bad, and that although the disguise looked good on the outside, if they suddenly started touching him, they would easily guess everything. Suddenly, the man hugging Taiga said that there was a strange feeling. The voice shouted loudly that it was a man and that there was a trance among the girls. The voice in my head started to panic, wondering if they'd been discovered after all. Suddenly, a strange girl fell to the floor. Shoko and Taiga looked in the direction where the fight had started. One of the men approached the girl and hit her, loudly asking who brought her here. The dark-haired man came over and hesitantly replied that it was him and that he was sorry, and the enraged blonde asked what he was even thinking. The guy replied that he had a very feminine voice, and that he was as surprised as he was. The blonde man approached him and said with displeasure that he couldn't even bring a girl with him, and that such a person only deserved to die. He swung his fist, intending to hit him, but a man came up behind him and put his hand on the man's shoulder. With a smile on his face, he told the blonde to stop already. The blonde looked at the big man in surprise, and then added that people just have different tastes. The man didn't immediately understand what he meant, and then, with a grim smile from under his brow, he added that he had brought him here precisely because he thought he was beautiful. Didn't he? Several people surrounded the man. Gokudō grabbed a guy in disguise by the scruff of the neck and told him to show him exactly what he was doing to him. The man screamed loudly, and his cry echoed throughout the room. The three guys standing around looked at this scene with a dark and shocked expression. Tanabe looked away nervously and said that someone must have dragged a man in disguise here. It seemed that the man was older than him and made such a stupid mistake. Someone asked Tanabe and clarified that he, said the opposite about bringing two beauties here. Akikawa said thoughtfully that he honestly didn't expect this to happen. The blonde asked where exactly the two girls were and that he hadn't seen Tanabe interact with any of them, even though he was the one who had brought them here. Tanabe replied with a nervous smile that he was wondering where they might be. The blonde looked at him with displeasure and asked if he had even heard their voices, and Tanabe replied that they had texted him that they were interested in the Midorikikai party. Akikawa folded his arms and looked away, telling him not to talk about how he really fell for it, and Tanabe scolded him to shut up and tell him that he was sad because of him. Tanabe said with a smile that they probably just wanted to meet someone from Midorikikai. I was sure of it. The blonde asked if he meant that they liked dangerous and bad guys, and Tanabe said how could he say no to them. Shoko stared at the stage with a grim face, her eyes wide. It was too cruel. Taiga was standing behind her. The man next to Taiga called out in displeasure and told them not to pay attention to it, and it was better for them to forget about them and have fun. The man handed the bottle to Shoko and asked if she would drink it, and the girl replied that she was underage. The man smiled in surprise and asked, "Is this really true and even minors are allowed to attend this party?" Shoko asked if it was just juice. A man with a cap pulled down over his eyes came up to them and put a glass on the table. He asked if an orange one would do. The girl thanked him and took the glass in her hands, taking only a small sip, but a loud voice told her to stop. They turned in the direction of the noise. The two men were surrounded by a crowd of people. They were barely able to stand, completely beaten up. In her opinion, it was too cruel, but at least the locals were kind to the girls, and if she interfered, they would definitely have to stop. Suddenly, Shoko's mind began to blur. For some reason, her head began to spin. A distant voice said in surprise that it was too fast, and apparently he went a little too far with the dosage. Shoko caught a glimpse of Banjo, who was also lying face down on the table. Shoko fell to the floor. She was very cold, and there was darkness everywhere. She didn't know where she was. She only felt that it was very warm and very cold. Suddenly, she opened her eyes. When she regained consciousness, the first thing she saw was a long chain running from her neck. Shoko was sitting in a huge cage. Cattles were on his arms and neck. She realized that something had been spiked in her drink. Realizing the whole situation, the girl began to call out loudly for Banjo, but he was nowhere to be found. Shoko clenched her hands tightly into fists and hung her head. How could it have turned out like this? The girl began to tremble and think that all this was because of Yusei, and it would be better if she didn't get involved at all. Then she wouldn't have had to find herself in the situation she was in now. A voice interrupted her thoughts, calling her number 3. The man came up to the cage and said it was her turn. She noticed a third number taped to her chest. She was released from the cage, led by a chain past many men. She couldn't even imagine what would happen to her now. All of a sudden, they were brought to a stage where several other similar girls were standing. All of them were shackled, standing on a lighted stage with their backs to the audience. Gokudō was smiling smugly, rubbing his chin. He happily stated that this time they had gathered a bunch of beauties. Gokudō was sitting on a raised platform in the middle of the stands. Shoko turned to look at him. She saw a man flanked by 2 beautiful women. Gokudō took a closer look and said that one girl was missing, and that he remembered her exactly. It was a girl with a good build. The man raised his hand and said that the person who was supposed to take her out has not returned for quite a decent time. Gokudō clicked his tongue in displeasure and said that he liked her the best of all of them. However, after a second, he waved it off and said that it wasn't that important, and among the options presented to him, there were still quite good girls. While Gokudō was looking at the girls on stage, he licked his lips viciously with his big tongue. Shoko frowned seriously. She knew that there was no way to stay here, and she had to wait for an opportunity to escape from here. Gokudō snapped his fingers and said it was time to start. A huge cage appeared on the stage, blocking the girls' view from all sides. Chains extended from the top of the structure, lifting the cage walls higher. Shoko looked at the railings in surprise. There was no way she could escape now. Gokudō grinned and shouted loudly at them not to just stand there and beat each other to a pulp until there was only one girl left. Shoko looked at him in surprise. Gokudō added, rubbing his chin with a smile and saying that he was not interested in weak women, and that it was a real pleasure to subdue a strong woman. He went on to add that the losers would be eliminated, and the winner would be his woman. Gokudō smiled madly and licked his finger, adding a last word to make them turn him on. He turned to a man standing nearby, who snapped to attention and told him to bring him a girl who wasn't in the arena until the fight was over, and if he didn't make it, he would die. The man immediately took off, saying that he would quickly bring her here. The chains around the girls' necks were gone, as were the shackles in various places. With a mad smile and burning eyes, Gokudō ordered the battle to begin. The 3 kids were also standing in the middle of the hall. The blonde man looked around the room and asked them if they thought that the crowd around them was somehow much smaller. Tanabe was drinking a drink and said that it wasn't uncommon for it to be a party, so some people were leaving, and it made sense that some people would come here for a couple of hours. The blonde man confirmed his words uncertainly. Both of them looked unsure of what they were saying. The blonde man asked if they wanted to go home, and besides, Gokudō was nowhere to be seen, and Tanabe said that the 2 girls he brought were also nowhere to be seen. Akakawa said that in the end, they never met them. Suddenly, an object on the floor caught his attention. When he picked it up, he looked at it carefully and said that they had similar student cards at school. Akakawa's face paled as he took a closer look. He looked at the name in shock. This couldn't be true. Why was student Shoko here? Indeed, the document contained a portrait of the girl and data written on the side. Gokudō ordered the battle to begin immediately, licking his lips with a bloodthirsty smile. He shouted for them to fight for the right to be with him. The biggest of the girls grinned. She clenched her hands into fists and slammed them together, her eyes lighting up. Her hair was short and red, and her body was large and muscular. The girl said that it was too easy, and that if she just killed them all, then she would have the opportunity to wring the neck of that guy on top of her. It was the number 1 fight. The other girl standing to the side was smoking a cigarette. She had long blonde hair. She mockingly asked what kind of neck they were talking about, and that Mr. Alex should paw it, and she would beat everyone here to a pulp. It was girl number 2, a redneck. Shoko said nothing and swallowed nervously, looking around. Her number was 3, track and field. The girl with 2 ponytails tied at the side sighed in displeasure. She was sitting on the floor with her legs crossed and her hands behind her head and said that it was somehow unfair because she was not in her weight class. It was number 4, Bangaru. Another girl in a sports uniform with a short haircut came forward and said that she wasn't interested in what the reward was, and if they want, they can attack. It was number 5, Karate. The last girl, number 6, was shaking as she clutched her hand. She stared at the scene in front of her and said, "Why did it turn out this way?" "This is number 6, ballet." The girls looked at each other. The biggest of them, number 1, said that if you beat everyone, then why not start with the strongest one? She turned to the girl at number 5 and she asked what she needed. The girl came closer and asked number 5 what exactly she did and if it was martial arts. Number 5 replied with a serious face that karate is an unusual martial art and it builds up the spirit. Number 1 listened to her with a smile on her face and snapped her fingers and said that she would be fine. Pointing towards number 5 with her finger, she told her that the girl would be the first. Number 1 immediately sped up, rushing at the girl at full speed. With a crazy smile, she told her to let number 5 amuse her a little longer. Number 5 barely managed to dodge. Number 1 was very fast. Number 5 only thought that she couldn't compete with her in pure strength for sure. Number 5 took a stance with her fist in front of her. Despite the difference in their weight and build, number 1's actions were easy enough to read. And if number 5 makes it, he can win with just one punch. However, as soon as the girl swung, the blow missed. Number 1 managed to dodge in time. She hung like a huge shadow over the girl and grabbed number 5, knocking her over and taking the girl for a chokehold. Number 5 gritted her teeth and couldn't believe what had just happened. How could she move her center of gravity so easily? Number 1 smiled maliciously and told the girl that number 5 could start crying, and number 1 actually had many titles. Among them were finalist of the World Junior Wrestling Championship, 3-time Junior Wrestling Champion in Japan, winner of the competition for the title of the strongest in his generation, champion of the Asian Wrestling Championship, winner of the competition for the title of the strongest in her generation, winner of the All Greens Championship Cup, 4th place in the men's and women's wrestling competition. However, even all of these rewards were nothing more than trinkets to her. The rules in wrestling only limited her. She was tired of this pampered world, and that's why she immersed herself in the world of violent street fighting. She used a wrestling technique to grab the opponent and then used choking techniques that are forbidden in normal wrestling. Number 1 continued to ring number 5 so hard that the girl began to tremble. Number 1 asked if she had learned to live by the rules within the walls of her dojo. A good and well-behaved girl, she would never beat her. Shoko ran up to them in horror and told them to stop, because at this rate she would kill her. Number 1 smirked and asked, wasn't it obvious from the beginning that she was going to kill her? Shoko ran over and grabbed her arm, trying to move it somehow. Shoko wrapped one of her hands in both of hers, and number 1 let go of number 5 in surprise and jumped out of the way. The other girls looked at the scene in surprise and didn't understand what had just happened. Number 1 was looking at Shoko, who was holding number 5 and trying to bring her to her senses. Number 1 decided that Shoko was trying to break her fingers with this move. There were various ways to get out of the grip by hand, and the simplest, but forbidden way is to break the finger of the hand that holds in the grip. Shoko wanted to do it without hesitation. She was sure of it. Was it really not that simple? Suddenly, the girl with the ponytails laughed loudly, clutching her stomach. She said through laughter that it was extremely hilarious how such a huge thing suddenly got scared and ran away. Number 2 turned towards the girl in displeasure and shouted out to her, is she really that strong to laugh at them like that? But the girl immediately spread her hands and told her not to be so angry, and that in the first place, she was not interested in winning or losing. She was not interested in the prospect of being in the arms of a gorilla as number 2, and that she would never give up on her. Number 2 smirked, thanking her but telling her to listen to her carefully. Number 2's face immediately twisted in anger and she clarified who this girl had just called a gorilla, and that she didn't dare to insult Mr. Alex like that. The men behind the cage started asking loudly and saying whether they were going to fight at all or not, and didn't they understand what would happen to them if they lost. They'll have fun anyway, but what the girls should do is another matter. Loud, nasty laughter echoed throughout the space. Number 5 scratched her head and said that she didn't really want to be in the arms of a gorilla, and she didn't really want to die in their arms either. Number 2 yelled out that she was already tired of talking, and the girl immediately put her hands up and asked her to slow down a little and that she didn't really like pain. However, number 2 didn't even listen to her, swinging her fist at her, but number 4 managed to strike first. Number 2 staggered back, the blow catching her jaw. In the next second, she fell to the ground. Number 4 took a fighting stance. She said she had warned me that she didn't like pain, and that her hands hurt after being hit, even though she had tried to warn me. Shoko watched it all with a frightened face. Number 4 had scared her, and it was clear that she was strong enough. It looked adequate, and you can negotiate with it in case of something. Number 4 turned to number 1 and told her to get this giant woman over to her quickly, and that she wanted to get this over with as soon as possible. Number 1 stared at her indignantly. Number 4 said that even though she was used to wearing gloves, number 1 should definitely be as soft as a whipping toy so she could make a chop out of it. Number 4 quickly stepped up next to number 1, intending to punch her right in the jaw. The girl was taken aback by surprise and did not react immediately, having only managed to cover herself from the barrage of her blows. She realized it was a boxer. The punches were incredibly fast, but too weak for no one. No matter how much number 4 hits her, her body can withstand all the blows. As long as she's protecting her chin, she might just break through. Only this number 4 will not win. Number 1 broke through to the girl, opening her arms and intending to grab her, but number 4 did the opposite, and because the girl opened up, she hit her right in the stomach. Number 1 doubled over, clutching her stomach. She couldn't believe that such a small body had such an incredible impact force. Number 4 grinned and turned around, clenching her hand into a fist. She said that the girl was incredibly stupid, because she did not understand that you also need to be able to hit correctly. Shoko watched in surprise as number 4 won. She smiled nervously and thought that since that crazy whopper had lost, she might as well try talking to number 4 normally. Shoko hesitantly raised her hand and started to address number 4 and say that now they should discuss everything, what exactly they will do next. However, her words were interrupted by a loud bang. Shoko opened her eyes and looked at the pile of bodies lying around number 4. Shoko asked her in horror what she had done, and the girl calmly replied that she couldn't just walk out of here if she didn't win the fight first. Number 4 took up a fighting stance, jumping up and down on the spot and beckoning Shoko to attack first. Shoko was thinking in a panic about what she should do, and couldn't there be another way. She thought of Mr. Banjo. Akikawa's loud voice rang out throughout the building, demanding to let the 3 of them pass. They were standing in the hallway in front of the entrance, which was blocked by several guys. One of them replied that Mr. Gokudō was currently having fun and should not be disturbed. Akikawa shouted loudly that Shoko might be there right now, and that she was a typical nerd who didn't know how to fight at all. One of the men ordered him to shut up immediately, because he was the right-hand man of the year, and that even in this state of affairs, they still dared to contradict him. The blonde didn't bother to listen to him too much, and his fist landed squarely in the man's face. A few other guys at the entrance started making a fuss and talking about how Masuda had just been knocked out. The blonde man calmly said that you need to listen to your elders, and Akikawa was his friend long before he joined Midorikikai, and if they didn't let them pass, he would destroy every single one of them with his own hands. Number 4 was beckoning the girl to attack. Shoko held her hand and asked her what she was just saying and that there was no one else who wanted to fight. Shoko tried to calm the girl down and held up her hand, telling them to calm down and think about how they could get out of here. Number 4 said that Shoko should understand everything herself, that there was no way out, there was only one way out. Shoko tried to get through to the girl anyway and said that that was why she was suggesting that she come up with something. But number 4 interrupted her and said that she had to fight, and only then would she be able to leave here. Shoko said that she had never fought, to which number 4 grinned and charged at the girl with her fists. However, a second later, as soon as her fist was a couple of centimeters away from Shoko's face, she stopped. Shoko was standing in the same spot. Number 4 turned away from her and told her not to think she was a fool, and that Shoko had calculated the range of her punch perfectly. A person who hadn't fought once wouldn't be able to dodge so perfectly. However, Shoko put her hand to her chest and said that it was the absolute truth and that she really had never fought in her life. However, they still managed to teach her exactly how to defend herself. Taiga and Shoko were standing behind the house. The man told her that before they went there, he would teach her something. The man held up a finger and told her exactly what to do if she got into a dangerous situation. Shoko nodded and listened intently. Taiga began to describe that they needed to consider several options for when the enemy had a weapon and when they didn't. In both cases, the enemy's attack range will be limited, with a long arm or a long leg. In the case of a weapon, the length of the arm and the size of the weapon. There is always a limit to everything. If you keep your distance, you won't get hurt for sure. Shoko hesitantly said that Taiga made it sound like it was very easy. Taiga replied with a calm face that if you have good reflexes and dynamic visual acuity, it shouldn't be a problem for you. Shoko raised her hand. What should I do if the enemy has a firearm? Taiga confidently folded his arms and frowned, saying that in that case, just give up. However, if there is no choice, then you need to hold out as far as possible. The further away you are, the harder it will be to hit you. Shoko listened intently. Taiga added that the most important thing is that no matter whether the enemy is armed or not, you need to remain calm. Shoko looked down. At the same time, number 4 launched another punch, and the girl barely managed to dodge it. Number 4 began to complain that she had already annoyed her. Shoko realized that she really wasn't hitting it, and if you keep calm and watch her punches, she will never hit it. Number 4 was thinking to herself and couldn't figure out what was wrong with Shoko. It was immediately clear that she was clearly not used to fighting, but she was just dodging and had no intention of counterattacking. Number 4 continued to swing and throw punches. She was thinking, did Shoko do this by accident? Takes out on pure talent. However, it was lucky that they were in the ring. Shoko ended up pinned against the wall of the cage. Number 4 wiped the sweat off her face and told the girl with a smile that she wouldn't be able to run away for long anyway, and that as soon as she hit the wall, she would be finished right away. Number 4 asked Shoko that she must have seen a boxing match at least once. When someone is pinned in a corner, a barrage of punches immediately descends on them. Number 4 swung, intending to throw a punch at the girl. Shoko remembered Taiga's words. He told her that he would teach Shoko how to avoid a situation where there was nowhere to run. Shoko crossed her arms and charged towards number 4. The girl didn't expect Shoko to decide to rush forward, and with the speed of her movements and her own weight, she definitely wouldn't be able to stop her. Shoko wrapped her arms around the girl's legs. She did it. Mr. Banjo had taught her that, too. Taiga said that of course, her opponent would probably understand what she was trying to achieve and think that she was just dodging. Then the enemy will just start to drive you slowly into a corner, into a dead end, against a wall or on a cliff. And then there will be nowhere to retreat. Shoko asked what she should do in such a situation, and Taiga replied with a thumbs up that it was only a leap forward. A kick or arm kick becomes powerful at speed, and when the arms or leg are fully extended, the speed will cover the lack of strength. Shoko said that it sounds difficult, because she will probably need to aim, and Taiga replied that there is an option when you don't have to aim at all, and after you break through, the enemy will be stunned. Taiga walked past the mannequin, hitting it and adding that if there is a slight weight difference between you, then after pushing the opponent's legs, you will need to put your hands where the joints are and sharply knock him down, and then you will be able to hit for sure. Taiga demonstrated everything on the dummy, grabbing it by the feet and knocking it to the ground. Number 4 stared dumbfounded at Shoko, who climbed on top of her and swung her fist over her face. Shoko was looking at her with serious eyes. The girl asked Taiga how best to strike. Taiga explained that you need to hit with your elbow to accurately knock out the opponent, and Shoko repeated the image of the banjo in her head, raising her elbow over the face of number 4. The girl looked at her in horror and surprise. She realized that she had underestimated the girl. No one had ever climbed it like this before. Unlike competitive boxing, the streets didn't have these stupid rules in a ring. It was hard to knock her down, because due to the lack of a ring, it's hard to pin her down. She just maneuvered with ease. She always worked her feet well. I honed my speed so that it would never be underestimated, but in the end I stepped on the same rake myself. She underestimated her opponent, and that's what it all led to. Now the stars will fly. Number 4 covered herself with her hands, but nothing happened. She wondered why it didn't hurt at all. Number 4 didn't understand why it was so easy. She opened her eyes and saw Shoko standing in front of her. The girl was standing in front of her in a counter. Number 4 wondered why the girl was so far away and not on top of her. Shoko remembered what Taiga had told her. He said that you need to hit the elbow to knock out the opponent, and this is an ideal option. But with the power of Shoko, she is unlikely to be able to knock out a person. Before the enemy wakes up, you need to break the distance and run away. Taiga asked if the girl was from the track and field club. Shoko pursed her lips. She thought to herself and asked Banjo in her head, what should she do now if there was nowhere else to run? Number 4 started to slowly get up and say that even though she didn't understand Shoko's actions, she definitely wouldn't give her a second chance. Number 4 clenched her hands tightly into fists, gritting her teeth. Gokudō, who was watching, was having fun. He licked his lips and giggled, saying that the ending is always the most interesting. Suddenly, someone's screams interrupted him, drawing his attention away. Gokudō yelled at them to stop yelling right away, because he was enjoying the show, and the man apologized and said that Jajima's boys were here. Hearing the familiar name, Shoko looked around. She saw 3 kids covered in cuts and bruises, and behind them on the floor lay the people of the years. Akikawa went to the cage and called Shoko's name, and she was surprised to see Yause and asked him what they were doing here at all. Akikawa shouted that he would explain everything later and that they would get her out of there now. An enraged voice was heard asking them what else they were up to. His eyes were blazing fiercely, and he was looking directly at the 3 boys. Akikawa had told him that up to this point, he had turned a blind eye to everything for years, and that ignoring everything for so long didn't give him the right to say so, but he was still a man. Akikawa clenched his fist. Akikawa looked at Gokudō and said that he couldn't just stand there silently watching how much he wanted to hurt Shoko. Gokudō asked what the others were going to say. The blonde man frowned and told the older man to excuse him, but he was still Akikawa's friend. Tanabe smiled awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, giggling and telling them that he had actually told them that it might not be worth it. The blonde ran up to him and grabbed him by the collar with a furious face, still shaking him and asking him whose side he was on, and Tanabe replied that it was just that they were facing years after all. Gokudō grinned and surprisingly replied that they did, as it turned out, have some kind of male core after all. The guys told him that he taught them to live freely, to get out of the way of those you don't like, and now the one they don't like the most is himself, Gokudō. Gokudō jumped down from his seat, stretching his arms. He asked what happened next, and since when did they suddenly think they were stronger than him? Gokudō walked up to the blonde man and made a fist, driving a punch into his gut. He continued to talk about how they were going to see if they were really stronger while using his other hand to punch Tanabe in the temple. Two guys immediately fell down. Akikawa tried to attack from behind and kicked Gokudō, but he didn't move. Gokudō spun around and punched Akikawa in the stomach, sending him sprawling on his back and telling them to cheer him up properly. Akikawa's back hit the cage railing, and Shoko ran up to him. She asked if the guy was okay, and Yusei hesitantly replied that he was. Shoko shook and asked why he had come to save her. Gokudō grinned and asked if Yusei was a friend of hers. Yaosei leaned on his elbows and replied that he didn't come here to save her, but only to return what she had dropped. The guy was holding her student ID in his hand. Yaosei handed her the document, and Shoko stared at it in surprise. Yaosei stretched his neck and said that once they had dealt with this, they could start winning. However, Gokudō was a real monster. Taiga was standing in his disguise in the building. It was now clear to him what Midori Kakai's true nature was. Before his eyes was a whole plantation of forbidden plants. He glanced over his shoulder at the unconscious man on the ground. He didn't even think that he would be able to find something like this. His infiltration strategy worked just fine. He had to free Yusei and the other guys. I must destroy this organization to its very foundation. And to do that, he needed proof of their crimes. Taiga took out his phone from his pocket and started shooting a picture of plants in front of him, taking pictures. Evidence in the form of distribution of prohibited products on the territory of the country. He looked at the many bodies that lay scattered on the floor. They had a good security detail here. Taiga took a couple of pictures and put the phone back in his pocket. He thought that Shoko had probably already waited too long for him. Suddenly, he was interrupted by a uniformed man running over. He shouted out that he had finally found the girl, and that she had somehow run too far. However, as soon as he looked down at the bodies of his colleagues, the man immediately took a step back in horror and asked what had happened here in the first place. He asked if the girl could knock them all out. Taiga turned to him and ordered him out of the way. He frowned menacingly and asked if he wanted to be on the floor in exactly the same position. The man immediately fell to the floor in fear, letting out a loud squeal. He watched Taiga leave and wondered if some girl had knocked them all out. What a shame. A dark-skinned man in a hat was holding a huge broccoli in his hands, taking a huge bite. He complained that he didn't eat enough vegetables. It was Midori Kakai performer Miguel Greenwood. The employee began to giggle and said that this female gorilla should start praying, because she would never defeat Mr. Miguel, because this was an amazing man. A former boss of the overseas mafia, he was sentenced to 350 years in prison, but he escaped and disappeared into their country. The real devil. The man pointed a finger in Taiga's direction and asked if she was immediately afraid and that her hamstrings were probably shaking. But suddenly a huge broccoli flew straight into his mouth. Miguel stood over him and ordered him to shut his mouth immediately and said that he described him as if he was some kind of coward who ran away and hid. The man on the floor immediately apologized. Miguel turned to Taiga and told her that she had heard everything herself and that he was second only to Alex in terms of strength among the locals. He told her to think about it because mafia bosses are usually old men, and Miguel was still quite young. He looked at Taiga carefully and asked if she understood what was being said, but the answer was no. Miguel chuckled and adjusted his hat on his head, saying that in that case, he would explain better. He had a gun in his other hand. The boys continued to fight, striking him one blow after another. The blonde man punched him in the face, but it didn't have any effect. Gokudō grabbed him by the shoulders and slammed his forehead into his head, causing the boy to immediately fall back. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with Gokudō. The blonde man got up and stood in front of him. It was as if they were looking at Iron Man and nothing less. Yaosei was about to throw another punch at the guy's back, but he caught sight of him just in time, glaring over his shoulder with his fierce eyes. Yaosei thought to himself that their blows didn't affect him at all. Yusei ran away and wanted to strike to try a different strategy, but it didn't work out. As soon as he kicked it, he immediately fell to the floor and clutched at the bruised one. He kicked out his leg, cursing loudly. Yaosei shivered, frowning and clenching his teeth. He couldn't believe it. It was all nonsense, and what kind of body did he even have? Gokudō squinted at him and grinned, saying that Yusei had learned something new after all. I've already been through a lot of fights and realized that you need to aim for the legs against strong guys, and that's why Yaosei thought that the legs would be a weak point for him. Gokudō grinned as he flexed his shoulders and added with a smile on his face that he knew absolutely nothing about human anatomy, and he had never studied any martial arts either. Yaosei, with a vicious expression and sweat dripping from his face, asked that was it really just a huge amount of physical strength that he had. Gokudō asked if there was anything else they needed besides that, because up to this point, no one's praising technique had helped them beat Gokudō, so why would they learn anything from such weaklings? Gokudō said that Yusei was just like him anyway. Gokudō grabbed him by the scruff of the neck, slamming a huge fist over him and adding with a crazy smile that no one else understands better than Gokudō himself anyway. The strongest don't need any techniques. Gokudō's blow landed squarely on Yusei's face. Shoko grabbed the bars and shouted the boy's name loudly. Number 4 walked over and put her hands behind her head and said out loud, "I wonder if you'll survive another blow." After all, the sound was just right. Shoko turned to her sharply, provoked by her words, and the girl immediately waved her off, telling her to relax. She folded her arms across her chest and said that no one cares about them yet, so she suggests that we take a little look at how their fight will end up. Shoko asked if she was suggesting that she just watch Yakuza get beaten up, and number 4 asked her what she could possibly do in a different situation. Shoko clenched her hand into a fist and said that if the 3 of them lost, they would have problems again. And the girl reluctantly agreed with this, but added that she just had to believe in them, because they still might have a chance to win. Shoko glanced back at the sound of a clank and saw the blonde man already on his feet, leaning on the iron beam in his hands. He frowned and told God that he was a terrible monster, but he wasn't going to give him a second break. Number 4 said that since they couldn't beat him with their fists, it was possible that they couldn't punch him in the head with their weapons as well. The girl smirked and told Shoko that she also didn't think the guy looked much more confident with a gun in his hand. Gokudō grinned and asked if he was serious and that he had seen something like this in a textbook. Takuya Jajima practiced martial arts. There was no use for his skills in a fist fight. His friends didn't know anything about it either. However, he clearly felt that due to the difference in strength, he didn't have a chance with his fists. However, he was doing kendo. Takuya held up an iron beam in front of him, pointing in the direction of the ear. Now he definitely won't lose to him. Takuya Dojima was the son of a famous dojo master. In the past, he admired his father, so he devoted himself to kendo, but due to one incident, he lost confidence in the dojo. He dropped his sword and went on his way. Now, he was determined to fight seriously. Gokudō smirked and asked Takuya, does he really like to throw out loud words? Gokudō took up a stance and urged him to attack him, adding that he wouldn't leave a wet spot on the blonde. Takuya remembered his lessons. He was standing in front of a man in a sports kimono, both of them holding wooden swords pointed at each other. The basis of kendo is proper distance management. Step forward, attack, step back, retreat. He had to be able to attack and retreat in an instant. It was a lightning sword technique. Takuya charged at Gokudō with a peculiar sword at the ready. Gokudō grinned in surprise. It was necessary to understand that the enemy would not stand still. There was no need to focus on individual parts of the opponent's body and monitor the movement of the entire body. Then no matter who your opponent is, they can't escape your sword. Takuya squeezed his eyes shut and then opened them wide, frowning and looking seriously in front of him. If he knew about all these techniques, even mountains would fall before him. Find the weak point. Work with your feet. Attack. Defend yourself. The father hit Takuya on the head, hitting his protective helmet. Takuya knelt down on one knee in front of Atsu and placed his sword on the floor. The main thing was not to forget, when attacking the enemy, fill your lungs and shout at the top of your lungs. This way, he can become even stronger. Takuya let out a loud shout as he charged straight for Gokudō, the iron beam in his hands at his side, his arms wrapped tightly around it. The enemy with weapons is always unpredictable. I thought the other way around. With a crazy smile, he was ready to take the opponent's blows. What's the difference? Kendo Shmendo is all complete nonsense. It's just enough for him to withstand the blow and everything will be fine. Gokudō was about to grab Takuya, spreading his arms out to capture him. That's it, this will be the end. With wild eyes and a wide grin, he waited for Takuya to finally attack. With a sharp kick, Takuya staggered him with the iron beam hitting him on the body. The guy stopped abruptly, turning around. He stared at Gokudō with burning eyes. The man couldn't understand what had just happened. Did Takuya strike so quickly? I couldn't figure out how he managed to do it. His face was clearly surprised. Gokudō gritted his teeth. Takuya was standing behind him, weapons drawn. I thought to myself that I didn't even see the guy swing the pipe. The average kick speed in kendo was only 0.2 seconds. If the blow was delivered by a professional, the speed of the blow could reach as much as 0.1 seconds. Gokudō looked over his shoulder at him and gritted his teeth. The guy said something with displeasure that he was actually in quite a bit of pain right now. Yusei, who was watching from the side, smiled and clenched his hand into a fist. He couldn't believe that Takuya was actually caught. Yusei smiled and shouted loudly to his friend that he could definitely beat him. Takuya frowned and thought about how anyone else would have fallen with just one punch. He couldn't figure out what was wrong with his body and how he didn't dump it. Takuya looked at Gokudō and thought that he must have been really serious. Takuya tightened his grip on the weapon. He said that kendo is a variation of swordsmanship. It was originally designed to kill people, and Gokudō shouldn't have forgotten that. In Kendo, you don't just wear armor, but even so, it can't completely protect you. However, during duels, there are cases when the opponent died from a rupture of internal organs due to a direct blow to the body. This is a deadly martial art. Shoko and No. 4 watched the fight in surprise. Shoko smiled and said that at this rate, Takuya would definitely be able to win. Number 4 nodded and said they would hope so. Takuya exhaled. Gokudō looked at him carefully and watched him. He could see that Takuya was about to attack. Takuya immediately took off, and Gokudō smiled contentedly, thinking that he knew it, but Takuya was charging at him with a weapon held out in front of him. Gokudō didn't have time to keep up with his speed, but he thought that Takuya wouldn't be able to catch him anyway. Takuya rushed past, and a stream of blood spurted out of the boy's forehead. The man fell to the ground. Yasei exclaimed in surprise and couldn't believe that he really failed him. Miguel, meanwhile, had started a shootout with Taiga, and all he had time to do was maneuver between the bushes of plants. They started chasing each other, and Taiga managed to hide under one of the trees for a while. Miguel stopped shooting for a second and said that he was probably starting to lose a bit of his grip on the skill. A worker with broccoli in his mouth exclaimed in surprise at the skill with which this woman dodged all the bullets. From a distance, it was easy to dodge bullets. During the shot, the main thing is to move away from the line of fire. Miguel told the man in front of him that he probably wasn't just lucky, because he pointed a gun at her and she didn't even freeze in fear. This was clearly not an ordinary woman. Miguel smiled as he looked at Taiga from under his hat and asked if she was a case of a killer. Taiga said no, standing behind Miguel and knocking the gun out of his hand. Taiga replied that he was currently working as a cleaner. The watching employee paled even more and thought that she had broken the distance in just an instant. Miguel started to pretend that she had won, but then pulled out another gun, holding it to Taiga's forehead. Miguel smiled and told her that she couldn't dodge point blank, but as soon as he looked down at his hand, he saw that he didn't even have the other gun. In the next second, Taiga twisted Miguel's arms, knocking him to the floor and holding a gun to his head. A loud gunshot rang out, but Taiga didn't shoot him in the head. The shot landed on the floor. Taiga said that he was a cleaner and wouldn't finish him off. Miguel lost. He took a closer look at Taiga and said that he had seen him somewhere before anyway. He recognized the assassin who had destroyed their organization, but he didn't expect it to be a woman. Taiga said that he had spent too much time with them and was about to leave when he heard someone shout. It was Shoko who was asking me to stop. Yusei was lying on the ground. Takuya was covered in blood and unconscious. Gokudō's face was wild, his eyes bloodshot and ready to pop out of his skull. A blonde man in a blindfold, one of the members of a popular band, rode his bike up to the building where the whole mess was taking place. He looked at the phone and made sure he was in the right place.